The Battle of Stalingrad. It's probably the most famous turning point of World War II. But what if I told you the outcome was basically set in stone long before a single soldier ever stepped foot in that city? Today, we're going to dive into how Germany's most catastrophic defeat was, believe it or not, pretty much doomed from the very start.
You know, this quote from Adolf Hitler, man, it really says it all. This is the level of insane overconfidence Germany had when they first rolled into the Soviet Union in 1941. They were thinking weeks, maybe a few months, tops, a quick, easy victory.
Yeah, about that, he couldn't have been more wrong. By the end of 41, the German army wasn't celebrating in Moscow. They were freezing to death at its gates and getting pushed back. That whole quick victory idea? Dead and buried. And that failure set the stage for a new, desperate campaign. One where the plan itself had disaster baked right into it.
So here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll look at just how desperate Germany's situation was. Then, we'll pick apart the deeply flawed plan they came up with. We'll see how a moment of overconfidence completely sealed their fate before diving into the brutal battle itself and the Soviet trap that snapped shut. And finally, we'll tally the unbelievable cost of it all.
Okay, so let's set the scene. It's 1942, and for Germany, things are looking dicey. Failing to take Moscow was a massive blow, but worse, their war machine was running low on everything, especially fuel. Oh, and the United States just officially joined the party. Hitler knew the clock was ticking, and he was staring down the barrel of a two-front war he could not win. He needed a miracle, and he needed it fast.
And that miracle had a name: oil. The entire German war effort was thirsty, running on fumes, and their own supplies were critically low. So for Hitler, those huge oil fields down in the Caucasus region weren't just a bonus, they were everything. Without that oil, the war was over. So this desperate, all-consuming need for oil became the one and only thing driving their big summer campaign in 1942.
And that desperation leads us straight to the plan itself, which they codenamed Operation Blau. It was this huge, ambitious attack. The idea was to drive south, smash the Soviet armies there, set up a big blocking line on the Volga River, and then the grand prize: swing down and grab all that precious oil. Sounds simple enough, right?
Well, not so much. The plan was fundamentally broken from day one. I mean, first off, their supply lines, their logistics, were already a complete nightmare. The distances they had to cover were just insane. And because they were stretched so thin, they had to rely on their Italian and Romanian allies to guard these massive flanks, and those armies were just not well equipped for the job. And of course, the classic mistake. They completely underestimated the Soviets' ability to just keep throwing more men into the fight.
But here's the crazy part. For a little while, it actually looked like it was working. When Operation Blau kicked off, the Soviets were caught totally off guard. They were expecting another attack on Moscow. So they fell back, and the Germans advanced really fast. And back in headquarters, this early success led to this incredibly dangerous sense of, I told you so. And this right here, is the moment it all goes wrong. On July 23rd, Hitler looks at the map, sees the Soviets retreating, and thinks the war is already won. So he makes a monumental, history-changing decision. He literally throws out the original plan and orders his army group to split in two. One half would keep racing for the oil, while the other half, the Sixth Army, was supposed to turn and capture this city on the Volga, Stalingrad, at the same time. He split his forces, trying to grab everything at once. You can just see how quickly it all unraveled on this timeline. There's that initial success, but then, boom, July 23rd, the fatal split. A few weeks later, the Germans reached the first of the oil fields, only to find the Soviets had destroyed everything. A total bust. Meanwhile, the Sixth Army, bogged down by supply issues, finally crawls to the edge of Stalingrad, and waiting for them was hell on earth. And this is where the entire campaign just descends into one of the most savage, brutal battles in all of human history. The city's defense was put in the hands of General Vasily Chukov, a guy who was absolutely determined to hold the city or die trying. The stage was set for this awful, bloody fight in the rubble. And here is one of the greatest ironies of the entire war. The Germans started their attack on the city with this massive bombing campaign that turned Stalingrad into nothing but rubble and ruins. But in doing so, they accidentally created the perfect battlefield for the defenders. All that wreckage was a nightmare for German tanks, but it was an absolute paradise for Soviet snipers and small squads fighting a vicious, close-quarters battle.
On top of that, in the twisted streets of the city, the Germans found out their tanks were just outmatched. Let's talk about the Soviet T-34 for a second, because this tank was a real game changer. That innovative sloped armor made it incredibly tough to kill. Even the Germans admitted it was probably the best all-around tank they'd ever faced. And in a street fight, that made a huge difference. Beyond the machines, the human cost was just staggering. This story about a German soldier named Fritz Luderitz really brings it home. He wrote about trying to celebrate Christmas in some frozen bunker. He even got married to his fiancée back home by proxy, just hoping that the next Christmas would be better. He never saw it. He was just one of hundreds of thousands who simply disappeared into the chaos.
So while the German Sixth Army was bleeding to death inside the city, the Soviets were patiently preparing a trap, a giant noose. And on November 19th, they sprung it. They called it Operation Uranus. Over 1 million Soviet troops, with thousands of tanks, didn't attack the city itself. No, they smashed right into those weak Romanian and Italian flanks, and they just crumbled almost instantly.
In just 4 days, the two giant Soviet pincer arms met. And just like that, snap, the trap was shut. The entire German Sixth Army, over 200,000 men, was surrounded, trapped. The German generals on the ground begged Hitler to let them try to break out. He refused. He would not give up a city named after his arch-rival. Instead, he made a promise. The Air Force, the Luftwaffe, would fly in all the supplies they needed. It was a promise that was impossible to keep. And from that moment on, the end was inevitable. It was just a slow, agonizing death. For 2 more horrible months, the starving and freezing remnants of the Sixth Army held out. But by the end of January 1943, it was over. Hitler actually promoted the commander, Friedrich Paulus, to field marshal at the last minute because no German field marshal had ever surrendered. It was a pretty clear hint that he expected Paulus to commit suicide. Paulus refused.
So let's talk about the final cost, because the numbers are just hard to even wrap your head around. In just those 5 months, the Axis powers lost around 500,000 men, killed, wounded, or captured. It's just an incredible figure. But as horrifying as that number is, the price the Soviets paid was even higher. They took well over 1 million military casualties, with close to 500,000 of those being deaths. It was a victory bought with an absolute ocean of blood.
And then, of course, you have the people who actually lived in Stalingrad. At least 40,000 civilians died, trapped in the ruins of their own homes, as these two massive armies just tore their world and each other to pieces. Okay, so after seeing all that horror, let's circle back to that big question we started with. What really made this disaster so inevitable? How was it doomed from the start? Well, the seeds were planted right from the beginning. It all started with a desperate gamble, which was then built on a deeply flawed plan. Germany simply didn't have the troops or the supply lines to pull off such an ambitious goal. They, again, totally underestimated their enemy's resolve. And then, the final nail in the coffin was Hitler's own hubris. That fatal decision to split his forces, which basically guaranteed that both objectives would fail. And the impact of this defeat was, well, it was decisive. Stalingrad was the high watermark for Nazi Germany in the East. It was the point where the tide turned for good. After this, their path was just one long, bloody retreat all the way back to Berlin. So I'll leave you with this final thought to chew on. This whole campaign was a massive gamble, we know that, born out of desperation. But just think about how the course of the war, maybe all of modern history, might have changed if the people who made that gamble had been forced, somehow, to look at its deep, obvious flaws before they ever rolled the dice.